What's up everybody, my name is Chris and today I want to talk to you about 32-bit float recording and what it means. This is all done because I recently upgraded my kit to the Zoom F6 and I was getting to know that device. One of the big selling points is 32-bit floating point audio recorded into WAV files. Now this is actually something that changes the workflow quite drastically if you are not careful, and it might not even be something that you really need. Now first I wanted to make a video specifically about how I'm getting used to 32-bit float with the Zoom F6. However, in the process I also noticed that it might be interesting to dive deeper into 32-bit float versus 24-bit to begin with, to even understand or begin to understand what is happening here, how this is actually affecting the workflow, and then later on make another video about how you might have to deal with certain aspects, specifically with the Zoom F6. Now for starters, 32-bit floating point audio is not something that is necessary for every single situation out there. There are good reasons why you might want to stick to a normal 24-bit audio with a good limiter, for example. However, 32-bit floating point audio recording is definitely a step in the right direction to be able to do more with your sound, and it gives you a great deal of flexibility, especially in post-processing if you want to have that. Now for a start, let's look into what this 32 even means and how it compares to the 24 that we had before. Now audio is processed and stored in different kinds of ways, and there are certain numbers relating to that are important in looking at this whole topic. The two that I'm mostly concerned with in this video are sample rate and bit depth. The sample rate is a number that is generally given with a, for example, 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. There's also 96 as well as 192 kilohertz. However, we are going to put those last two aside for today because those are mostly used in high quality audio recording for sound effects and similar. And that's not necessarily what I want to focus on today. So I'm going to be talking mostly about 48 kilohertz here. But how does the sample rate affect the audio recording? Now for that we have to go one step further back to the way that the audio is transformed from an audio signal to a digital signal. And what happens there is that something that is a very nice analog curve actually has to be stored in numbers 1 and 0, so in bits. Now, to be able to do this, we have to take this continuous flow of a wave of an audio signal and basically chop it up into little pieces. And that's actually the sample rate. You basically take that waveform in a certain time frame, for example, for 1 second, and that wave goes up and down in there. Now, with the sample rate, we chop this 1 second into little pieces. And with the case of 48 kilohertz, we actually chop 1 second into 48,000 little pieces. So now that we have our waveform that is chopped into little pieces, we have to store the value that the wave was at for any given point in that time frame. And for that, we have the bit depth. And in the bit depth, essentially what we are decoding is which value that was set at. Now, the higher the number for the bit depth, the bigger the number range that can be signified in that. So for example, we have that 1 second, which is chopped into 48,000 little pieces. And with a bit depth of 24-bit, that number goes from 0 to plus something and minus something. And for this range, you have a bit depth of 24, and that would actually give you something around 16 million different possible combinations. Now there's tons more to learn about bit depth, and I'm probably also going to misrepresent some information here, but for the purpose of my understanding it was enough, and maybe this helps you understand this topic more as well. Now a couple of more things that I want to mention here is that with the 24-bit, something I also read about is that basically louder values are stored with more detail than less loud values. Now that specifically accentuates the issue of noise, and especially if you are trying to increase the volume in the post-processing because you are bringing something that has less detail in the lower volume range and making it louder, bringing up that not existing detail and thus also bringing up the noise floor. And that specifically is what the 32-bit floating point is actually targeting. To round up the sample rate and bit depth topic, the sample rate is essentially how many times you chop 1 second to make little pieces, and then the bit depth signifies how much information, or with how much detail the value of the wave is being stored. But so now what's up with 32-bit and how is it actually different from the 24-bit that we had before? Because there's tons of people that would argue that 24-bit is plenty and everything you will ever need. Now the basic difference between 24-bit and 32-bit is how many numbers can be represented with that data. With 24-bit, you can basically create the numbers 0 to 16,777 and 216. This may be different with the processing of audio files, but this is the basic amount of numbers that you can create with 24-bit. Now, on the other hand, with 32-bit, you can actually create numbers anywhere between 0 and 4,294,967,296. So you have a lot more possible combinations there, lots more numbers to choose from, and just that much more detail that you can give in there. Now, the process of storing audio with the bit depth is actually not just taking a value between 0 and 16 million and storing that for the number of sample rate that you have per second, but there's actually a little more magic going on with the bit depth. Now, if you really want to learn more about these different formats, and there's actually, for example, also 32-bit non-float next to 32-bit float, and you want to try to understand that, then I have an in-depth article that I found on Quora, linked in the description down below. Now, I've mentioned before that in 24-bit, louder values are stored with more detail and more clarity than less loud signals. And that's actually the part that, as far as I understand it, the 32-bit floating point fixes the issue. Because there's actually so much detail possible that we don't have that anymore, and just everything gets stored with extreme accuracy. Now, this actually gives us more flexibility in post-processing, so that the 32-bit floating point signal can actually be processed multiple times, for example, adding gain or lowering the gain without losing any detail. Now, something to keep in mind, however, is that at the end, when you're listening to the audio signal, for example, after editing, you will always end up with a 24-bit signal, because that's also how our speaker systems work, our headphones, as well as all of those other things. Now, this basically means that the 32-bit audio is something that is really helpful whilst recording, not necessarily whilst in playback. And it also is something that you really have to keep an eye out for when you are editing in your editing program, because the waveform that you see is actually a 24-bit waveform that is being calculated based on the 32-bit float file. Now, jumping in from the future here, we have something on the screen right now, which is a 32-bit float file, and that has sections that are recorded at 24 decibels as well as minus 60 decibels on the Zoom F6's fader setting, and also plus 60 decibels. And what you can see here is that basically you still see everything on a 24-bit file, kind of like a timeline here. So it is still represented as if it were 24-bit. However, what we can do now is getting rid of this frequency spectrum here. Considering this here, this is the clipped version. And if I play this back right now, you can hear something like this. Plus 60 on the 32-bit float file. And there you can clearly see that it is a clipped signal, even though it does not sound as crushed as a 24-bit clipped signal would. But it still goes all the way up to the 0 dB marker. And we don't really want that. But what we can do, and that's because this is a 32-bit float file, which would not be possible in a 24-bit file, is that we can lower the gain right here, and you can see that all that detail is coming back. And there we go. And now as I can play this back, it sounds normal, has a normal volume response and all that. Plus 60 on the 32-bit float file. So you really have to remember this, that you need a program that supports 32-bit files, and also you have to remember which ones are recorded in which format. Usually that's stored in the metadata, because you won't necessarily be able to see whether or not you can recover these things. The same thing goes with this part, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. Now I really have to drill this down. What you play back is a 24-bit signal. However, you have the flexibility in an audio editing program that supports 32-bit floating files that you can actually basically recover information and bring that back into the range of 24-bit audio. Based on this information, you might already have a good idea of what this does for you in your workflow. But let's dive a little deeper in why this is important for us and specifically how it works with the Zoom F6 and what happens inside. Now the Zoom F6 field recorder is the one device that I have right here that records 32-bit floating point wave file audio. I'm also going to soon cover the Track E from Tentacle Sync, which will arrive shortly and also supports 32-bit floating point audio recording. So check out those videos as well. Now specifically with the Zoom F6, they have a very interesting way of how they can achieve a very low noise floor and also record that to 32-bit float. And they're achieving this with double analog to digital converters, also known as AD converters. And there, one of those AD converters is basically tuned for louder sounds, and the other one is tuned for less loud sounds. And those two have a certain area of overlap as well. The signal from those converters is then combined to one signal that covers the full range from very silent sound to very loud sound, giving you an incredible dynamic range. And this dynamic range is then able to be stored in a 32-bit floating file. So now we have a 32-bit float audio file combined with extremely low noise analog to digital converters, and all of that with the ability to raise the gain and lower the gain in post-processing without raising the noise floor as well. So now we are back on the screen recording right here. We have our 32-bit float file, and this is really where the magic happens. This section right here, we can just bring this up all the way to about a nice degree so that it looks like this, and it has all the detail that you would want. For there is a fountain. But then we have this section back here, which, if you remember, that was the section that was completely clipped before and we were able to recover it. And then we have this middle section right here, which is recorded at a setting of -60 decibels in the recorder, and we can actually bring this back, even though you don't hear anything and you don't see anything on the levels here. If I start to bring this back, now this is 30 decibels, this is 45 decibels. Now we are at, what is that, 60 decibels? And you can see that there's a signal coming back, 75, then we have 90 and 105, well, 94, something like that. But now listen in on how this actually sounds even though it was recovered from an basically invisible signal. Dig deep within yourself, for there is a fountain. And that's how a basically invisible part looks on a normal 24-bit timeline here, and it was able to basically be completely recovered without adding too much noise. Now I have an example how this would look if you were to have something like this with a 24-bit file. This here is the 24-bit file at a trim of 12 setting in the recorder, and what we can try here, this is the silent setting basically, so you can see that it's about -38 decibels here, and I can bring this back with 15, 30, and 30 something decibels, and you can hear it like this. The fader set at 0. Now if you were to measure this, this is a higher noise floor than in a 32-bit float file, but the F6 here actually produces a fairly clean signal, so this may actually be usable. However, the story quickly changes as soon as you switch to a file that has been clipped already in the recorder. Now I have not used any limiter in the Zoom F6 because that's not the point that I'm trying to make here. One should probably also compare 32-bit float to a 24-bit with a proper limiter, but a limiter also can do only so much for you, and it may still need you to kind of like adjust the gain so that it actually doesn't engage all the time throughout. So it is a safety measure for 24-bit recording when you don't have 32-bit available to you or you don't want to use it, but for full flexibility you would still want to go for the 32-bit float file. Now here again we have a 24-bit file that has its trim set to 75 decibels on the Zoom F6, and this here is completely crushed. If I play back a little segment here,
fader and 0.
You can hear that it completely clips. It also shows the same on the levels right here. And if I try to recover something here, let's say I select all this and I try to bring it back, you can see that there's no detail whatsoever in this file. This is basically a destroyed recording. You can't really work with this unless you wanted to really go into recovery programs that are there to kind of like fix sound issues like this. This is unrecoverable just with those normal tools. It is still clipped, and if I play this back,
fader and 0.
It might not be as loud as it was before because I pulled back the gain, but it still is very much clipped into oblivion. Now there are also some counter arguments to 32-bit floating point audio recording, and most of those are around the topic that you don't really hear the difference in clarity or the difference in detail in the sound, that cannot really be represented. And the same discussion is also done with sample rate. So some people say 48,000 Hz is enough, some people say that 44.1 kilohertz is enough, and others say you need 96 or 192 kilohertz of sample rate to have good sounding audio. Now, I don't really want to jump into this because it's not my place to make that decision. I right now think that 48 kilohertz is enough for most of the things that I do. If I were to do audio recording, for example, for sound effects, then I would probably choose the 192 just because I can. But with 32-bit float recording, I think there's a very different point to be made in terms of the ability that it gives you in the post-processing. Now, I mentioned before, everything you hear is 24-bit anyways, and the 32-bit floating point is basically just for the acquisition. So if you record something with 32-bit, then you have more freedom in the post-processing. Kind of like a raw photo is something that you don't really see on the screen, but you have a better ability to change that file and edit it as you want to have it, and then you see the final image. And that's kind of similar with the audio here. You have the raw file, which is the 32-bit float, but what you actually hear is the 24-bit version of that, or the down-calculated version of that. But something else to keep in mind here is that some programs don't understand 32-bit float recording, and also your workflow might work differently with 32-bit float recording versus a 24-bit recording with a good limiter. But I'm specifically going to cover that and how your workflow changes in an upcoming video, so stay tuned for that. But so what are scenarios in which it might be helpful to have 32-bit float recording, and why do I think that you probably want this technology as well if you can get your hands on it? Now, one of the first scenarios that comes to mind and is frequently mentioned with people that are reviewing the Zoom F6 is basically the one-person team where you are running audio and video at the same time. Having 32-bit float audio recording gives you the flexibility to be able to step away from the audio recorder after hitting record and being there with peace of mind that you are most likely going to be fine. Unless, for example, the microphone position is changed or in some kind of way not working out. However, you're at least safe to know that if people start screaming or clapping or laughing or singing or being louder than they should have been, you are going to be totally fine. And the same thing is true if they start whispering for whatever reason. So you know that you can just bring those signals back or turn them back down, and you have something that is not clipped, sounds great, and you can continue working with that. So in this case, 32-bit floating point audio just gives you much more peace of mind, and I would absolutely recommend you look into this. Something similar, going even a little further, is when you are the person behind and in front of the camera at the same time. And this is, for example, something where I see this as a great benefit to myself, specifically when I want to do interview type things where the audio equipment is something that I don't want to focus on or have to look at all the time, because this is actually something where I want to interview a person and I want to focus on that person and not on my equipment. And with this technology, I can do this, have the peace of mind, know that I can do things in post-processing if anything changes, if my gain settings aren't set correctly, and so on. Now, purists probably would say just get a sound guy, but there's oftentimes just not the budget for that. And again, having this technology can really give you a lot of flexibility in fixing things in post. Even though it might be nice to have that audio person, for example, monitoring the sound, also making sure that mic positioning is correct and staying on point and those things. But if you can't really have that, then this is a lifesaver. Now, two more scenarios that come to mind for this technology are client shoots as well as events that are really fast paced, and I want to get into that. However, with client shoots, it just gives you the flexibility to know that you don't have to reshoot something because you messed up the gain, for example. Time is money, and here you can fix things in post. This is especially true if you have things that can't be repeated or at least not easily repeated. For example, having a person in-house that's usually not there. And that actually is something that is also true with the interview part that I mentioned before, where you want to record everything on the spot and you can't repeat the setting because you might have traveled to a different country or a different city to even have the opportunity to sit down with someone for an interview. 32-bit float gives you the safety that you know you have the audio no matter what happened, if the gain was mixed up or anything like that. Now, nobody really wants to go to the client and say, hey, I think we messed up the audio. Can we maybe have another date or do this again? And nobody really likes this. It costs money, it costs time, and being safer is always the better route there. Now, lastly, what I mentioned with events, that's something where I can see this totally rock the boat because things are moving very quickly. For example, at a conference where every speaker always is going from one place to another and you want to pull them in for a couple of questions to your video in some kind of interview way. Now, if you want to release those things really, really quickly and you just push them out the door and or live stream, this might not be interesting to you. However, if you want the safety again to be able to fix things, then this might be really interesting for those moments where someone says, hey, I have this guest right here. We have to do the questions right now. Hit record there, hit the record there, and we are good to roll. However, what happens if you might have messed up the gain there? Forgot that the person speaking before was really loud. Now you have someone who is holding the mic really far away and you don't have the ability to change the gain or you forget to change the gain. Again, floating point audio helps there because you can fix it in post with normalization and you're good to go. So overall, you can see 32-bit floating point audio is a lifesaver in those situations where you don't have a sound person. But even if you do have a sound person, that person also can be there with more peace of mind, knowing that you can't really mess it up because you have the flexibility in post to work with this. Now, if you want to have a really fast-paced workflow where you don't want to normalize or do any of those other things in post, or you have programs that are not compatible with 32-bit files, you might want to look to 24 bits with a good limiter. That's something that even the F6 here supports as well, and most other devices that are 32-bit floating point also support this kind of setting. But I really like having the peace of mind that the 32-bit float gives me on everything that I am doing with this, and it was the main reason why I upgraded from the H5 to the Zoom F6. But this is not a feature that is only available in the Zoom F6, it is available in other devices as well. However, the Zoom F6 is the device that I have on my hands right now, so I can speak more about it. Now, something that might be specific to the Zoom F6 are the dual AD converters. However, I haven't quite looked into other devices that may have this feature as well. Some devices that also feature 32-bit floating point audio, for example, are the MixPre's 3, as well as the Track E from Tentacle Sync. For me, comparing the Zoom F6 to the MixPre, it made more sense to get the Zoom F6 because of its 6 ports that I can use to potentially record up to 6 people in a podcast situation, as well as just have availability for more microphones. The MixPre 3, for example, only supports up to 3 devices, and comparing the price points, it made more sense to go with the Zoom F6. Now, if you're looking for an audio recorder, you have to really keep in mind if you need the 32-bit audio floating point recording or if it's not really necessary for your use case and the device that you are looking for. The Zoom F6 is a great choice for those scenarios that I described before. Podcast interviews where you can't really check the gain and you are not really able to do those things and you want to do the post-processing after. If you are on shoot and you don't really have the ability to redo something and also don't have the ability to monitor the device. and if you're the only person on set. Then those situations really give a good reason to go with a 32-bit float audio recorder. However, if you have the ability to monitor the audio, it might not be worth it for you to look into 32-bit float recording because this is a relatively expensive investment. Alternatives that you might be interested in are the Zoom H5, H6, H8, or the PodTrack P4 from Zoom, or the Rodecaster Pro, which are both devices that are specifically made for podcasting. Those devices, if set up correctly with gain, limiter, and then monitored during the shoot, can give you a really good quality audio file, which is not 32-bit floating point, but 24-bit. This still gives you good flexibility in post, for example, to adding an equalizer or compressor or similar things. Now, what they do, however, give you are other features. For example, with the PodTrack P4 or the Rodecaster, those are dedicated for podcasting. They give you more flexibility in certain areas there. And also, if you do live recordings, those might be an interesting choice for you. Now, in conclusion, 32-bit floating point audio is a technology that really is worth looking into, knowing about, and also knowing when to use and when not to use. It basically brings the ability of raw photo or video editing to audio, which was kind of overdue. So I hope with this video you have a bit of a better understanding of this technology and also know if you want to rent, for example, an audio recorder for your production that has this feature, or if it's something to consider worth buying into as you upgrade your equipment. Now, I strongly recommend looking into this if you are a solo shooter or if you are doing things that are not repeatable and you don't want to have to stress about whether or not the audio gain is set correctly. Now, I hope this basic overview of how 32-bit floating point audio works was helpful for you. If it was, I would greatly appreciate a thumbs up and if you leave a comment down below. That helps out the channel a lot. If there are any questions left, you can also put those in the comment section down below, and I will either try to make a video about it or answer you right there. Now, if you don't want to miss out on any of the upcoming videos about the Zoom F6, podcasting in general, as well as more topics that I'm going to cover here, then hit the subscribe button. Also, activate the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of that. Now, everything I have left to say is have an amazing day, make sure your audio is not clipping, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao. Ah.